I didn't hear this story from a report, and I didn't hear it from an officer trying to impress anyone with how close he'd been to the line. I heard it in pieces, late, from a man who said he was there and no longer cared whether I believed him. We were waiting for transport off the Italian coast, stuck in that idle space between orders and movement, where people talk because silence gives them too much room to think. February 44 was technically behind us, but it hadn't let go. It clung to skin and fabric and memory like damp cloth that never quite dries. He told me early on that this wasn't something he experienced directly, not in the heroic sense people usually mean when they tell stories years later. He hadn't seen the beginning, and he hadn't seen the end. What he did was watch it happen around him, night after night, and then watch it get edited down into something manageable. He said that mattered, that it changed what the story was. He wasn't trying to claim ownership. He was trying to get rid of it. He warned me that memory slips in places like that. Cold, exhaustion, constant immersion. They smear time. Hours stretch. Nights overlap. And things repeat until you're not sure if you're remembering one event or several layered on top of each other. He said he wouldn't swear to exact minutes or distances, but he swore one thing without hesitation. Something was wrong, in a way shellfire alone doesn't explain. Men disappeared from standing water that should have drowned them loudly, violently, with thrashing and noise. Instead, they vanished cleanly, and it happened more than once. According to him, it was Anzio and Nettuno, the marsh ground behind the beachhead, where the line didn't look like a line at all. On paper it had shape and depth, but on the ground it was more like a spill. Flooded farms flattened into brown, motionless sheets of water. Drainage ditches blown open by shelling until they merged with fields. Reeds thick enough to hide water deep enough to take a man if he stopped moving or shifted his weight wrong. The marsh didn't announce danger, it waited. You didn't dig there. You couldn't. The ground collapsed in on itself the moment you tried. Instead, you balanced. You built upward. Platforms, crates, doors pulled off hinges, anything that could spread weight across more surface area. Men learned quickly how much stillness marsh tolerated and how much it punished. Cold immersion, collapsing trench walls, feet that never dried. He said all of that was normal. Miserable, but normal. What wasn't normal came the first night the guns went quiet. Bellini's platoon held a shallow arc between a mined road and the reed line, a curve that only really existed on maps. The ground itself didn't care about geometry. Sentry platforms were spaced just close enough for coverage, just fair now that each man felt alone once the firing stopped. The first request came close to midnight. A sentry radioed in and said the water was already up to his chest. He asked to pull back a few meters, not abandon the post, just enough to get onto ground that wouldn't take him if he shifted wrong. Bellini denied it. The man telling me this was careful about that detail. He said Bellini wasn't cruel. He wasn't careless. He was afraid of thinning the perimeter, afraid of creating a gap, even briefly, that could be exploited. One soaked soldier seemed like a smaller risk than an opening that might invite something worse. That decision appears later in a compiled record, the man said, but stripped of urgency and consequence. On paper, it reads like routine discipline. In the marsh, it felt like something else. The exact timing varies, depending on who you ask. It always does. The first sighting, he said, wasn't even called a woman. The radio log just notes movement observed around 2:10. A human-shaped figure crossing a flooded sector without sinking. No challenge issued. No shot fired. The marsh takes weight greedily. Men learn that quickly, or they disappear themselves. This thing didn't. A corporal later told an officer he saw a person coated in mud, hair plastered flat to the skull, walking between wire stakes like she knew exactly where to place her feet. Bellini dismissed it as exhaustion, or enemy scouts, and ordered nothing. No flares, no probing fire. Silence, in his judgment, was safer than light. Morning came gray and thin. 2 sentry posts were empty. No bodies surfaced. The platforms remained slick with algae and reed pollen. Pressed into the boards were deep finger marks, 4 grooves per hand, too even to be explained away as damage. A medic later remarked that the wood looked compressed, not struck, as if something had leaned into it slowly and with intent. Bellini signed a partial report blaming disorientation and poor footing. He didn't change the order that had kept the sentry in place. The second night, the pattern became harder to ignore. When artillery stopped and the water smoothed, she moved. There were no footstep sounds, no splashing, just a slow drag, like soaked cloth pulled across wood. She'll never cross dry ground. She didn't approach posts that had been quietly pulled back from the water line. She appeared where men had been told to hold longer than advised. One sergeant disobeyed orders and moved a sentry upslope without filing it. That sector was untouched. Where Bellini held the line exactly as drawn, losses followed. Men noticed. They didn't speak openly about it, but they adjusted how often they shifted weight, how long they looked at the water before looking away, how quickly they answered the radio when it crackled. On the third night, around 1:40, a radio opened without a call sign. No words followed, just wet breathing, slow and deliberate, like someone balancing on something unstable and concentrating too hard to speak. The operator cut the transmission. 2 men later said the breathing continued for a few seconds after the switch was thrown. The official log calls it humidity interference. One of the men insisted the time in the log was wrong by at least 10 minutes. Interference doesn't keep breathing after you shut it off. After that, the evidence stopped being subtle. At least for the men who had to move through it. A runner was sent just before dawn to check a post that hadn't answered to scheduled calls. He left with a lamp hooded tight and a rope tied to his waist, standard precautions for the marsh. He never came back. When they went looking for him later, his tracks were clear and ordinary until they weren't. Boot prints, evenly spaced, leading straight into standing water. No churn, no sign of panic. They ended cleanly, as if he had stepped forward once more and decided not to continue. That morning a dugout was found opened from the inside. The door was warped outward, the wood swollen and bowed, but the hinges were intact. Whoever opened it hadn't forced it violently. Inside was a body arranged as if resting. The boots were clean. The trousers were soaked only to the knees. Both knees showed bruising, even and symmetrical, like pressure applied from below rather than impact from a fall. A medic examined the lungs and said there was marsh water present without the usual tearing or froth that came with drowning. He didn't put that into writing. Bellini listened to the verbal report, nodded once, and said nothing. Men began to vanish between checks, not in firefights, not under shelling, between one radio call and the next. A helmet was found upright at the edge of a minefield, filled with mud, chin strap unbroken. Someone joked weakly that at least the mines were still doing their job. Nobody laughed. The marsh kept its shape. Nothing surfaced. She was seen again, always after the guns stopped, always moving between the same wire stakes Bellini had ordered left in place, despite rot and subsidence. Stakes that no longer marked anything useful, but which he insisted remain for orientation. She moved as if those markers mattered to her, as if they defined where she could go. Descriptions varied. Someone said her eyes were open but filmed over, reflecting nothing, not flares, not stars, not movement. Others said they never saw her face clearly at all, only the outline of a head where a face should have been. The reports don't agree there. They never could. Even men who stood 10 meters apart described different things. What stayed consistent was where she appeared and where she didn't. Command arrived with explanations already prepared: exposure, infiltration, rumors spreading under stress. A visiting officer walked the line in daylight and pointed out how easily men could misjudge depth, how reflections could trick tired eyes. He spoke carefully, the way people do when they already know what the paperwork will say. Bellini was ordered to submit a consolidated report using approved language. The previous partial reports were gathered up. A flooded dugout was burned to prevent disease. Steam rose thick and white from the marsh, curling low and heavy. It smelled of rot and fuel and wet earth. The water stayed. Personal effects were left inside the burned dugout because retrieving them would have required men to stand in the water longer than anyone wanted to justify. The line held. History recorded no woman of mud. After rotation out, men stopped talking about it the way soldiers usually stop talking about places they survived. Not with relief, but with avoidance. The man who told me this said years passed before he heard the last detail, and when he did, it came from Bellini himself. Not at a reunion, not in a formal setting. Just once, after enough time had gone by that no one was listening closely anymore. Bellini said that on the final night before rotation, the guns stopped and nothing happened. No breathing on the radio. No movement between stakes. No marks on the platforms. The marsh lay flat and ordinary, as if it had never learned their names. Men finished their watches without incident. For the first time in days, nobody went missing. At dawn, Bellini went to his command table to complete the last of the paperwork before handing the position over. The table was rough crate wood, salvaged and nailed together on site, swollen from constant damp. When he put his hand down to steady the paper, he felt resistance. When he lifted it, there were finger grooves pressed deep into the wood. For grooves, evenly spaced, damp. Exactly where Hishand had rested on the night he denied the sentry's request to pull back. Bellini said he stared at them for a long time before anyone else came in. He didn't call for a medic. He didn't call for witnesses. He wiped the table clean and finished the report. That detail never went anywhere. It wasn't written down. It couldn't be. The man who told me all this said he didn't know whether to believe that last part. He said memory does strange things when guilt sits in it long enough. He said Bellini might have needed the story to end somewhere it could be contained. He admitted that possibility freely. He wasn't defending it. He was weighing it. I don't know if that part is true either. I only know that when the man finished talking, there was dried mud under the edge of the table between us. Not a smear, not a footprint. Just a thin, cracked line of it, where no one had put their feet. Neither of us remembered tracking it in. We sat there for a while, without mentioning it, listening to the water slap against the hull outside, waiting for transport that was already late. Neither of us moved our chairs back until someone else came into the room.